This common healthy habit is killing your stem cells. Every day, I did this for years. For many years, I consistently engaged in practices that I genuinely believed were beneficial for my well being. I was convinced I was making the absolute best choices for my body, meticulously tending to my health. My routine included regular exercise, careful attention to my diet, and maintaining an active lifestyle. In my mind, the occasional restless night or the undeniable stress that came with managing a demanding professional practice were simply unavoidable consequences, the expected price one pays for leading a productive and fulfilling life. What I didn't realize, what no one explicitly told me, and what, astonishingly, many medical professionals are still not communicating effectively to their patients today, is a crucial truth. Three specific habits, which I had always considered protective pillars of my health, were, in reality, silently but powerfully accelerating the degradation of the very cells my body relies upon for its fundamental functions: repairing damage, regenerating new tissues, and maintaining overall vitality as I age. I am referring to stem cells, but not the controversial embryonic kind you might have heard discussed in the news. I'm talking about your very own adult stem cells, those incredible cells that are actively residing within your bone marrow, your muscles, the lining of your intestines, and even your brain right now. These are the master cells, the true architects responsible for mending damaged tissue, generating fresh blood cells, bolstering your immune system's defenses, and keeping the intricate machinery of your entire body running smoothly, decade after relentless decade. The extensive research I've immersed myself in over the past several years, specifically rigorous, peer-reviewed studies published in prestigious scientific journals such as Cell Stem Cell, the Journal of Experimental Medicine, and Nature Communications, collectively paints a profoundly different picture. This scientific body of work has genuinely transformed my perspective on how I approach even the most mundane daily health decisions. Consider this alarming statistic. Roughly 37% of individuals over the age of 60 in the United States are currently experiencing a measurable and often significant decline in their stem cell function, completely unaware that this vital biological process is faltering. This insidious decline doesn't manifest as a single, obvious disease. Instead, it subtly appears as persistent fatigue that even a full night's sleep fails to alleviate. It shows up as a minor cut or wound on your shin that now takes 3 times longer to heal than it would have 15 years ago. You might notice your immune system seems to be operating more slowly, less decisively, leaving you more susceptible to illness. Or perhaps you're experiencing a frustrating loss of muscle mass that no amount of protein consumption or increased exercise seems capable of stopping. These aren't isolated problems with disparate causes. More often than not, they are simply different facets, different symptoms of the same underlying issue: an aging stem cell pool that is being depleted far more rapidly than it should be, paradoxically, by habits that outwardly appear to be perfectly healthy. Before I delve deeper into these findings, and I emphasize this because it is critically important for your safety and understanding, please know that everything I am about to share is strictly for educational purposes. It is firmly rooted in published, scientific research and is intended to provide you with a clearer framework for comprehending your own unique biology. This information is absolutely not a substitute for professional medical advice or for working directly with your personal physician. If you are currently taking medications, if you have any pre-existing cardiovascular condition, diabetes, or any autoimmune diagnosis, it is imperative that you discuss this information with your doctor before making any adjustments to your current routine. What I am providing here is generalized scientific insight. What you choose to do with it should always be a thoughtful conversation with a healthcare professional who possesses a comprehensive understanding of your complete medical history. If you find discussions like this one valuable and enlightening, a subscription would certainly help me continue to conduct this vital research and bring it directly to you. However, there is absolutely no pressure. Now let's explore what the actual science reveals. My deliberate focus on habits that appear healthy is precisely because if I were to tell you that smoking destroys stem cells, you would likely nod in agreement and move on. The detrimental effects of smoking are already widely understood. What is far more useful, and frankly, considerably more alarming, is the realization that a particular form of exercise, enthusiastically adopted by millions of people over the age of 50 with the explicit intention of safeguarding their health, may actually be inflicting measurable damage on their precious stem cell reserves. Similarly, a common food item currently sitting in your refrigerator, proudly displaying labels like whole grain, natural, or high protein, is very likely classified as an ultra-processed food. And two, extensive national studies, both published in 2024, unequivocally demonstrate that regular consumption of such foods is measurably and quantifiably accelerating your biological aging. Furthermore, the fragmented sleep you may have resigned yourself to as normal simply because you are 53 or 61 or 70 years old, believing this is just how sleep is now, is anything but neutral. It is actively restructuring the genetic machinery of your blood stem cells in ways that even a full weekend of good rest will not reverse. The scientific evidence supporting these claims is not speculative. It's robust and comes from leading institutions like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, and Columbia, alongside some of the largest population studies ever conducted on human aging. What makes this research genuinely urgent for people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s is a fundamental biological reality that younger individuals simply don't have to contemplate with the same immediacy. By the age of 50, your stem cell reserve has already begun to decline significantly. This isn't because you've done anything wrong, but simply because it's a natural biological process. Estimates suggest that by the time you reach 50, the regenerative capacity of your hematopoietic stem cells, the ones in your bone marrow responsible for producing every single blood and immune cell in your body, has already plummeted by 30 to 40% compared to your 20s. That's the baseline. That's before any of the habits we're about to discuss even enter the picture. The profound significance of this is that when your reserve is already diminished, any additional stressor, any habit that further accelerates stem cell depletion or dysfunction, will have an exponentially larger and more damaging effect than it would in a 25-year-old. You have less margin for error, which means the information in this conversation isn't merely academic, it's intensely practical and time-sensitive. Let me begin by detailing the research, because I want you to understand precisely where these vital conclusions originate. In 2022, a collaborative team of researchers from the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, Columbia University, and Massachusetts General Hospital published a groundbreaking study in the Journal of Experimental Medicine. I consider this paper to be one of the most important, yet least discussed pieces of research on aging from the last decade. Their investigation was deceptively simple. What does disrupted sleep actually do to your blood stem cells? Not just your energy levels, or your mood, or your performance at work, but the stem cells themselves at their fundamental genetic level. What they discovered was profound. Sleep disruption doesn't just leave your stem cells feeling tired, it fundamentally restructures their epigenome. To truly grasp why this matters, imagine your DNA as an enormous library filled with countless instruction books. The epigenome is like the sophisticated system of flags and bookmarks that dictates which books get opened and read and which ones remain closed on the shelf. Chronic, accumulated sleep disruption, the kind that tens of millions of adults over 50 experience as merely normal life, literally reprograms those epigenetic flags. It alters which genetic instructions your stem cells are capable of reading. This alteration pushes them towards patterns of abnormal proliferation and an exaggerated inflammatory response. In essence, it doesn't just slow your stem cells down, it changes their very nature and function. The particular finding that compelled me to stop and reread the paper 3 times was this. Recovery sleep did not fully reverse the damage. The epigenetic changes persisted. The researchers weren't just measuring what happened during the disruption, They meticulously tracked what occurred after normal sleep patterns resumed, and the stem cells did not return to their previous healthy baseline. The reprogramming was durable. An earlier study from 2015, published in Nature Communications by Rolls and colleagues, had already demonstrated that sleep deprivation in donor animals significantly reduced the ability of transplanted hematopoietic stem cells to successfully engraft in recipients by more than 50%. The mechanism they identified involved a microRNA called MIR19B. Sleep deprivation suppressed it, which in turn elevated certain SOX genes, ultimately blocking the stem cell's ability to home to the bone marrow and establish themselves. What the 2022 Harvard paper added was the crucial understanding that this wasn't merely a temporary suppression, it was a lasting, detrimental reprogramming. For someone in their 50s or 60s, this carries a specific and urgent implication. You likely sleep less soundly than you did at 30. You probably wake up more frequently, take longer to fall back asleep, and spend less time in the deep, slow-wave sleep that is the most restorative phase. This pattern is almost universal in this age group and has often been treated clinically as a minor annoyance, something to manage with better sleep hygiene or perhaps a low-dose supplement. What this groundbreaking research now asks us to consider is whether it is, in fact, a hidden stem cell crisis quietly playing out in slow motion night after night across years and decades of our lives. The second body of research I want to guide you through concerns chronic stress. I'm not talking about the acute stress of a difficult conversation or a tight deadline, the kind that typically resolves within hours and, in moderate doses, can actually stimulate healthy cellular adaptation. Instead, I'm referring to the sustained, low-grade, always-on cortisol elevation that tragically characterizes modern life for many people over 50. This is the kind of stress where the source isn't a single, isolated event, but rather a persistent, underlying condition, ongoing financial pressure, the relentless responsibilities of caregiving, a career that never truly allows you to disconnect, or a pervasive baseline of worry that has been running for so long you've actually stopped consciously noticing it. A comprehensive review published in Brain, Behavior, and Immunity in 2022 meticulously synthesized decades of research on the intricate molecular pathways connecting chronic psychological stress to accelerated biological aging. The conclusion, stated plainly, is that chronic stress inflicts damage upon stem cells through multiple, simultaneous mechanisms. First, persistently elevated cortisol levels over time directly increase DNA damage across various cell lines, including the progenitor cells that give rise to stem cells, while concurrently reducing the efficiency of the body's natural DNA repair systems. This means your cells accumulate errors at a faster rate and are slower to fix them. Second, chronic cortisol elevation leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. Your cellular power plants, the mitochondria, begin operating inefficiently, producing more oxidative byproducts, specifically what are known as reactive oxygen species. These reactive species, in turn, create further cellular damage in a self-reinforcing, destructive cycle. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, chronic stress directly shortens telomeres. Telomeres are the protective caps found at the ends of your chromosomes, and their length is one of the most rigorously validated markers of biological age that we possess. Chronic stress specifically reduces the activity of telomerase, the enzyme responsible for maintaining telomere length, and accelerates the rate at which telomeres shorten with each cell division. Here's what makes this particularly significant for the 50-plus population. Research on adrenal aging has thoroughly documented that the baseline level of cortisol is already higher in older adults. Furthermore, the sensitivity of the HPA axis, the complex feedback system designed to shut down cortisol production once a stressor passes, becomes blunted with age. In a 25-year-old, cortisol spikes during stress but typically returns to baseline relatively quickly. In contrast, in a 60-year-old, that stress-induced cortisol spike tends to be higher, lasts for a longer duration, and the system's ability to reset takes considerably more time. The practical implication of this is profound. The exact same stressor produces a larger, more prolonged cortisol burden in an older body. The damage accumulates faster. The margin for tolerating chronic stress, which was never generous to begin with, narrows further with every passing decade. A more recent review, slated for publication in Frontiers in Aging in 2026, unequivocally confirmed the specific molecular cascade we are discussing. Stress chronically activates the HPA axis, which sustains elevated glucocorticoids. These, in turn, drive mitochondrial dysfunction, which increases the production of reactive oxygen species. This then creates oxidative damage precisely within the delicate niches where stem cells reside and are meant to be carefully maintained. Each individual step in this damaging chain has been meticulously measured, and each link has been unequivocally demonstrated in human tissue. This is not a theoretical pathway. It is a thoroughly documented series of biological events that is, in all likelihood, occurring right now in countless individuals who carry the kind of chronic stress load that modern life, unfortunately, encourages us to normalize. I now want to turn our attention to the finding that I believe will surprise the largest number of people in this audience. It's not the compelling sleep research, nor is it the sobering stress data. It's something you likely purchased at a grocery store, probably just this week, all while actively trying to eat healthily, ultra-processed foods. I want to be very precise about what I mean by this term, because ultra-processed often gets thrown around loosely, frequently applied only to obviously unhealthy items like fast food, candy, or potato chips. That narrow framing completely misses the critical point, and may be precisely why you've been unknowingly consuming these foods while genuinely believing you were protecting your health. The formal classification system utilized by researchers, known as the NOVA system, defines ultra-processed foods not by their basic nutrient profile, like how much fat or sugar they contain, but rather by the degree of industrial transformation they have undergone. An ultra-processed food is one that has been fractured apart from its original whole food matrix, then combined with a litany of industrial additives, emulsifiers, colorants, artificial flavor enhancers, modified starches, texturizers, and finally reassembled into a product that may superficially resemble, but is fundamentally not, whole food. By this scientifically rigorous definition, the following items are classified as ultra-processed: packaged whole grain bread, even the kind explicitly labeled 100% whole wheat. Many commercial fruit yogurts, including those aggressively marketed as probiotic and health-forward. Brand name granola. Nearly every single protein bar currently sold in the United States. Most commercial plant-based milks that contain gums, oils, or synthetic added vitamins, and virtually all breakfast cereals, including the ones championed as low sugar and heart healthy. If you examined your breakfast this morning and felt confident it was healthy, there's a very reasonable chance that a significant portion of it was, by this definition, ultra-processed. Two monumental studies published in 2024, both large-scale and rigorously conducted, quantified the precise impact that chronic consumption of these foods has on the rate of biological aging. This aging was measured not by how old you subjectively feel, but by validated biomarkers detectable in your blood. The first study emerged from the Molisani study in Italy, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in December 2024, involving an astonishing 22,495 participants. Esposito and colleagues discovered that a high consumption of ultra-processed foods was significantly associated with accelerated biological aging as measured by circulating biomarkers in the blood. This was not a marginal or weak association, but a statistically robust one found in a sample size large enough to possess substantial statistical power. The second study utilized NHANES data, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, which is arguably as close to a nationally representative sample of American adults as research can achieve. Published in H and Aging in November 2024 by Cardoso Lo Machado and colleagues at Monash University and Columbia University, this study found that for every 10% increase in the proportion of your daily calories derived from ultra-processed foods, the gap between your biological age and your chronological age increased by 2.4 months. Please read that statistic again, slowly. For every 10% days. If, for example, 40% of your daily calories come from ultra-processed foods, which is actually below the American average according to CDC data, you could potentially be carrying the equivalent of roughly 10 months of additional biological aging compared to someone consuming the same total calories from minimally processed whole foods. If your intake is at 50%, which epidemiological data suggests is typical for many, the math becomes considerably more concerning. Crucially, the Nachain's paper was careful to note that this association was partially independent of overall diet quality, strongly suggesting that the degree of industrial processing itself, not merely the macronutrient composition, is a primary driver of this accelerated aging. The mechanism behind this is not mysterious, even if the intricate details continue to be refined through ongoing research. Ultra-processed foods consistently alter the gut microbiome in ways that increase intestinal permeability, often referred to as leaky gut, trigger a low-level immune activation, and significantly elevate markers of systemic inflammation, specifically interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, and C-reactive protein. This state of chronic, low-grade inflammation, sometimes termed inflammaging in the gerontology literature, is directly hostile to healthy stem cell function. Stem cells do not exist in isolation. They thrive in meticulously maintained microenvironments known as niches, and these niches are exquisitely sensitive to inflammatory signals. When a stem cell niche is chronically inflamed, the stem cells within it shift from a state of productive maintenance and repair to a state of constant stress response. They either exhaust themselves trying to compensate, or they enter senescence, a state of suspended function that we will revisit shortly because it represents the critical convergence point for all four stressors we are discussing today. Now, I want to address the fourth habit, and this is the one I was most personally reluctant to discuss because it directly contradicts a message that many physicians, myself included for a long time, have consistently given patients for decades. Excessive cardiovascular exercise without adequate recovery is a potent stem cell stressor. Let me be absolutely precise here, because I am emphatically not telling you that exercise itself is bad for your stem cells. In fact, the evidence points to precisely the opposite conclusion. A landmark study published in Cell Stem Cell in April 2023, conducted by research teams at Stanford University and Baylor College of Medicine, performed single-cell RNA sequencing on an astonishing 435,628 individual cells across multiple tissues in both young and aged mice. This extraordinary level of resolution produced what is now the most comprehensive atlas ever published on how exercise affects the stem cell landscape of the aging body. The conclusion was crystal clear. Moderate aerobic exercise significantly reduces inflammatory signatures in muscle stem cells, neural stem cells, and hematopoietic stem cells simultaneously, and it powerfully restores intercellular communication patterns characteristic of younger organisms. Exercise, when performed correctly and thoughtfully, is undeniably one of the most potent protective interventions for stem cell function in the aging body that we currently know of. The problem arises when exercise ceases to be moderate, when recovery becomes insufficient, when the intensity and frequency are so high that the body never fully returns to its baseline state between sessions before being subjected to stress once again. In this specific scenario, exercise stops acting as a beneficial signal for adaptation and instead morphs into a chronic stressor. Cortisol levels remain elevated for longer than the body's biology requires. Reactive oxygen species accumulate faster than the body's natural antioxidant systems can neutralize them, and the muscle stem cells, known as satellite cells in the scientific literature, which are supposed to be diligently repairing the micro damage from exercise and building adaptive capacity, begin to exhibit the very same signs of exhaustion seen in other chronic stress contexts. The same Cell Stem Cell paper explicitly notes that aged muscle stem cells are already inherently more prone to cell death, senescence, and a loss of their myogenic potential, their ability to form new muscle tissue, compared to younger ones. Therefore, overtraining in a 55 or 65-year-old is not just a performance issue, it may be actively accelerating the depletion of the fundamental cellular machinery that maintains muscle mass, supports recovery from injury, and ultimately sustains physical independence over the long arc of aging. The pattern I frequently observe clinically in patients who come in frustrated, feeling that their body is simply not responding the way it used to, despite their admirable discipline and consistency, is often this. They are doing too much steady state or high intensity cardio, not nearly enough resistance training, and critically, insufficient recovery. They have mistakenly equated sheer volume of exercise with benefit, and at a cellular level, their bodies are quietly paying a steep price. This price doesn't necessarily show up on a bathroom scale or in easily quantifiable performance metrics, but it accumulates insidiously over years in the form of accelerated muscle loss, significantly slower recovery from illness and injury, and a pervasive feeling that their body is aging much faster than their seemingly healthy lifestyle should ever explain. Now, I want to explain the fundamental mechanism that intricately ties all four of these pervasive stressors together, because disrupted sleep, chronic cortisol elevation, ultra-processed food consumption, and excessive exercise without adequate recovery don't damage your stem cells through four entirely separate, unrelated pathways. Instead, they converge. They amplify each other's detrimental effects. And the critical convergence point is a profound biological process known as cellular senescence. When a stem cell is subjected to chronic stress, whether it's from persistent cortisol, from accumulating oxidative damage, from inflammatory cytokines originating from a disrupted gut microbiome, or from the accumulated failure of nightly epigenetic maintenance, it eventually reaches a critical threshold. At this point, it stops dividing altogether and enters a dormant, non-functional state. This is cellular senescence. And here's the part that is rarely explained clearly. Senescent cells don't simply stop working quietly and harmlessly. On the contrary, they begin actively secreting a potent cocktail of inflammatory molecules. Researchers refer to this as the SASP, the senescence-associated secretory phenotype. This inflammatory secretory profile then acts on neighboring cells, actively promoting their senescence as well. It creates a powerful, self-amplifying loop. Chronic stress creates senescent stem cells. Senescent stem cells, in turn, create more inflammation. And this increased inflammation further stresses the remaining functional stem cells, accelerating their senescence. A finding referenced in a comprehensive 2025 review of hematopoietic stem cell aging makes this particularly concrete and impactful. The research demonstrated that even transient inflammatory exposures, not just chronic ones, but single significant inflammatory events that eventually fully resolved, could produce lasting reductions in functional hematopoietic stem cells. Even a full year after the inflammation had completely subsided, the bone marrow had not fully recovered its original stem cell capacity. The system, it seems, does not easily forgive and forget. The choices you are making right now regarding how you manage your sleep, how you handle chronic stress, what you consume through your diet, and how intensely you push yourself in exercise are not merely affecting how you feel this week or this month. They are fundamentally shaping the precious stem cell reserve your body will have available for the next decade and far beyond. Let me take a moment to draw these four intricate mechanisms together in a way that paints a clearer, more practical picture. Imagine your stem cell reserve as a kind of savings account that you were born with a certain balance in. Since birth, your body has been slowly drawing upon this account to fund its daily repair and maintenance operations. By the age of 50, that balance is already meaningfully lower than it was at 25. This isn't a disease, it's simply basic biology. However, whether that balance continues to decline at a normal, gentle rate or begins to accelerate dangerously towards zero depends enormously on the specific environment you consistently create for those cells, day in and day out. Poor, disrupted sleep isn't just failing to restore the account, it's actively restructuring it in ways that make the existing balance less functional and less reliable. Chronic stress is akin to a high-fee account, steadily draining a small but constant percentage of what's held within. Ultra-processed foods are contaminating the very environment around the account, making every single withdrawal more costly and less precise. And excessive exercise without adequate recovery is like making withdrawals that are far too large, too frequently, before the account has had any time to properly replenish itself. Those four elements, especially when they act in combination, create a distinct trajectory for your biological aging. But here's the incredibly empowering news. This trajectory is not predetermined. It is highly modifiable. The groundbreaking research demonstrating that fasting refeeding cycles can restore aged hematopoietic stem cells to a state approaching youthful function is profoundly important precisely because it unequivocally demonstrates the remarkable plasticity that still remains within this system, even at an advanced age. Your stem cells are not simply counting down to a fixed endpoint. They are actively responding to signals right now. And the signals you transmit to them through your daily choices are far more powerful than most people, including many physicians, have ever been taught to appreciate. Here's what I want you to do with this invaluable information. Before anything else, please understand that I am sharing a framework for understanding, not a rigid prescription. Some of what follows will necessitate a direct conversation with your doctor, particularly if you are currently on medications, have specific diagnoses, or are contemplating any supplement protocols. Everything I am about to recommend is backed by peer-reviewed scientific evidence. None of it is conjecture, and I will clearly indicate where the evidence is stronger and where it might be more preliminary. As always, if you have any significant health conditions or are taking any medications, please speak with your physician before implementing any of the changes I am about to describe. This is the bedrock standard for responsible medicine, and I will not deviate from it for the sake of sounding more authoritative. The first and highest priority intervention, if you take nothing else away from this entire conversation, is sleep quality and consistency. Not just the quantity of sleep, although quantity certainly matters, but its consistency. The Harvard epigenomics paper is unequivocally clear that the circadian system, which is your internal biological clock that meticulously governs stem cell maintenance, responds more powerfully to regularity than to almost any other variable. Your stem cells anticipate sleep at a predictable time. Disrupting that expectation, even just on weekends, compounds detrimental effects over time. Therefore, pick a specific time to go to bed. Pick a specific time to wake up. And then, commit to holding those times 7 days a week, including weekends, for a minimum of 4 weeks. After this period, objectively evaluate how you feel. Most individuals who diligently implement this report a noticeable, qualitative change in their morning alertness within 10 to 14 days. It might not be dramatic, perhaps subtle, but definitely a discernibly different quality. For your environmental setup, your room temperature for optimal sleep should ideally be in the range of 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. This is the scientifically established range in which deep, slow-wave sleep, the most profoundly restorative phase, and the one that declines most sharply with age, is most readily accessible. Complete darkness matters far more than most people realize. Melatonin production in individuals over 50 is already substantially lower than in younger adults. Any light exposure during your designated sleep window will further suppress this already diminished residual production. Regarding caffeine, the metabolic clearance of caffeine slows significantly with age. In a 20-year-old, the biological half-life of caffeine is roughly 4 to 5 hours. In someone over 50, it may stretch to 8, 9, or even 10 hours, depending on individual genetics and liver function. This means that a cup of coffee consumed at 2 in the afternoon may still have meaningful physiological activity affecting your sleep at midnight. The practical guideline I provide to patients is simple: no caffeine after 1 p.m. Try this for 2 weeks before deciding whether it makes a tangible difference for you specifically. Finally, if you even suspect sleep apnea, a condition that is substantially underdiagnosed in this age group, particularly in women, address that before considering anything else. Fragmented sleep resulting from undiagnosed apnea will override every other intervention. You simply cannot optimize stem cell maintenance through sleep if the sleep itself is being interrupted dozens of times per hour by apnea events. The second priority is restructuring how you exercise, not necessarily reducing the amount of exercise you do. The Cell Stem Cell 2023 Atlas study is explicit about the intensity range that genuinely produces stem cell benefits. Moderate aerobic exercise, which exercise physiologists refer to as Zone 2. This is the intensity at which you can comfortably hold a conversation, but you are noticeably breathing harder than you would be at rest. At this intensity, the research definitively shows that you are actively improving mitochondrial function, reducing systemic inflammation, and stimulating the intercellular communication patterns associated with younger biology, all without generating the sustained cortisol elevation and oxidative burden that often accompany higher intensity efforts performed too frequently. The target, based on the robust evidence, is approximately 150 minutes per week of Zone 2 exercise. For most people, this translates to 3 to 5 sessions of 30 to 45 minutes at a brisk walking, cycling, or swimming pace. The kind of pace where you could narrate a podcast but wouldn't comfortably give a formal speech. The other absolutely critical component, and this is particularly vital for muscle stem cell health, is resistance training. Aim for 2 to 3 sessions per week, thoughtfully targeting all major muscle groups. Resistance training is arguably the most potent cellular signal we currently know of for keeping muscle satellite cells active and functional as we age. The loss of muscle mass that most people attribute simply to getting older is, at the cellular level, significantly driven by the declining activity of these crucial muscle stem cells. Resistance training is the intervention with the strongest evidence for reversing that decline. What I am asking you to consider pulling back from is not exercise in general, but rather excessive high-intensity, steady-state cardio performed without adequate recovery. If you are training intensely 5 or 6 days a week, if your resting heart rate is subtly trending upward over several months, if you are waking up feeling more fatigued than when you went to sleep, or if your performance metrics are declining despite your consistent effort, these are powerful biological signals that your exercise regimen has crossed the line from being a beneficial stimulus to becoming a chronic stressor. The stem cell biology at that point is not working in your favor, even if your discipline and commitment are truly admirable. The third priority is food. Specifically, it involves meticulously auditing what you are actually eating for its ultra-processed content, including, and especially, the foods you genuinely believe are healthy. Here's a practical and straightforward test. Carefully read the ingredient list on your bread. If it contains more than 5 or 6 ingredients, and if those ingredients include words you would never find in a home kitchen, words like modified starch, soy lecithin, datem, calcium propionate, mono and diglycerides, then you are, in fact, eating an ultra-processed food, regardless of what the appealing marketing on the front of the package claims. The very same test applies to your yogurt. Plain, full-fat yogurt with live cultures and no additives is not ultra-processed. However, commercial yogurt with added fruit preparations, thickeners, artificial sweeteners, and a 7-ingredient label most certainly is. This same principle applies consistently to granola, to most protein bars, to the vast majority of commercial cereals, and to nearly every packaged snack food that prominently deploys health language on its front panel. The practical intervention here is not about achieving perfection, nor is it about undertaking a wholesale dietary overhaul that feels daunting. What the Chain's 2024 study unequivocally tells us is that every 10% shift away from ultra-processed foods and towards minimally processed whole foods makes a measurable difference. It matters in ways that are scientifically quantifiable in your blood. Begin by identifying the highest frequency items in your current diet, and then diligently find minimally processed replacements. Swap packaged granola for simple rolled oats prepared with fresh fruit and nuts. Exchange commercial fruit yogurt for plain Greek yogurt, to which you add actual berries. Trade the ubiquitous protein bar for a small handful of mixed nuts and a piece of whole fruit. These might sound like incremental changes, but when compounded across weeks, months, and years, they are precisely the kind of shifts that the biological aging data suggests make a profoundly meaningful and measurable difference. For the broader dietary pattern, the overwhelming evidence consistently points towards several categories of food that powerfully support the cellular environment that stem cells critically need. Leafy green vegetables such as spinach, kale, and arugula consumed daily provide essential folate and other cofactors indispensable for DNA synthesis and repair, the exact processes that stem cells rely on for their maintenance and vital self-renewal. Fatty fish like salmon, sardines, and mackerel, eaten 2 to 3 times per week, supply EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids that effectively reduce the systemic inflammatory tone we have identified as one of the primary environmental threats to delicate stem cell niches. Legumes, consumed 4 to 5 times per week, lentils, chickpeas, black beans, provide the prebiotic fiber that nourishes a healthy gut microbiome, which in turn modulates harmful systemic inflammatory signaling. Berries, particularly blueberries, are among the most potent dietary sources of polyphenol compounds that directly counter the oxidative stress we have been discussing throughout this entire conversation. What you are consciously building with this dietary pattern is not just a more favorable macronutrient ratio. You are actively creating a systemic inflammation level, a gut microbiome composition, and a metabolic and oxidative environment in which your stem cell niches can maintain their optimal function rather than being constantly activated into detrimental defensive responses. The fourth priority, and I want to be clear that it is not less important, but rather plays fourth because it is often the most challenging to act on independently of the others, is chronic stress management. Specifically, the overarching goal is to effectively reduce sustained cortisol elevation. The intervention with the most consistent and robust scientific evidence behind it is mindfulness meditation, practiced consistently for 10 to 20 minutes daily. I am fully aware that this recommendation sometimes meets with resistance from individuals who consider themselves too practical or too skeptical for such practices. What I would earnestly ask is that you set that skepticism aside temporarily and genuinely look at what the objective measurements actually show. Research, including groundbreaking work by Elizabeth Epple and Elisa Epple at UCSF, has meticulously measured the effect of sustained meditation practice on both cortisol levels and telomerase activity, the critical enzyme that protects and maintains telomere length. Regular meditators consistently show measurably reduced cortisol levels and measurably increased telomerase activity compared to non-meditating controls. The mechanism is not mystical. It is the direct physiological consequence of repeatedly activating the parasympathetic nervous system and effectively dampening down the overactive HPA axis. The fact that the practice feels simple or even counterintuitively unsophisticated does not diminish its profound effects at the molecular level. Spending time in natural outdoor environments is another powerful intervention that is supported by more rigorous data than its inherent simplicity might suggest. Consistent research across numerous studies shows that 20 or more minutes spent in a green space, a local park, a walking trail, a quiet garden, produces measurable reductions in cortisol and shifts in autonomic nervous system tone from sympathetic, fight or flight, towards parasympathetic dominance, rest, and digest. The HPA axis, our stress response system, evolved within an environment that included substantial time spent outdoors. There is legitimate scientific evidence to suggest that the chronic absence of that natural context itself functions as a low-grade stressor. I also want to address, because patients regularly ask me about it, the crucial role of sleep quality in stress management, not just as a downstream problem, but as a direct cortisol regulator. One of the most robust relationships documented in the HPA literature is the direct link between poor sleep and elevated morning cortisol. This is a significant part of why prioritizing sleep is the very first step. Improving sleep directly reduces cortisol, which in turn reduces stem cell stress, which then reduces the senescence cascade, which decreases the inflammatory environment, which in turn makes it easier to sleep. These systems are profoundly coupled, and the coupling works powerfully in both directions. Now, I want to dedicate some time to a topic that the research is genuinely exciting about: intermittent fasting. And I want to handle this carefully because while the evidence is compelling in some contexts, it also requires caution in others. Research from MIT's Koch Institute, led by Yilmaz and colleagues and published in Cell Stem Cell, showed that a single 24-hour fasting period effectively doubled the regenerative capacity of intestinal stem cells in both young and aged mice. The underlying mechanism involved the activation of fatty acid oxidation pathways regulated by specific PP transcription factors. Essentially, the fast forced the stem cells to switch their metabolic fuel source in a way that significantly enhanced their regenerative function. Crucially for our audience, this beneficial effect was clearly present in aged animals as well as young ones. A 2024 study from Columbia University added a remarkable finding: fasting refeeding cycles, meaning deliberate alternation between periods of caloric restriction and normal eating, appear to activate autophagy in aged hematopoietic stem cells and substantially restore their function towards what you would measure in young animals. These are not marginal improvements. They represent the kind of functional restoration that strongly suggests significant biological plasticity remains within the aged stem cell system. However, and this is a meaningful however, research from MIT published in Nature in 2024 identified that the refeeding phase following a fast may potentially increase the rate of intestinal cell proliferation in a way that could elevate risk in individuals with pre-existing cancerous mutations in the intestinal epithelium. The context in which fasting is safe and clearly beneficial is not identical for everyone. If you have a personal or family history of colorectal cancer, if you have had intestinal polyps at any point, or if you are at an elevated risk for gastrointestinal malignancy, please have a specific conversation with your gastroenterologist before implementing any fasting protocol. This is not a reason to dismiss the compelling evidence for fasting. It is a critical reason to be context-aware and responsible about it. For individuals without these contraindications, without a history of feeding disorders, not on insulin or sulfonylurea class diabetes medications, and at a healthy weight, a moderate intermittent fasting approach appears entirely consistent with the beneficial biology. The 16-8 protocol, a 16-hour overnight fast followed by an 8-hour eating window, practiced 3 to 4 days per week rather than every single day, is the approach I have found most sustainable and effective for patients in this age group. A practical implementation might involve finishing eating by 7 p.m. in the evening and then having breakfast at 11 a.m. the following morning. That's a 16-hour fast without significantly disrupting social patterns. If you prefer to start more conservatively, a 14-hour fast, finishing at 7 p.m. and starting at 9 a.m., is a very reasonable entry point that allows your physiology to adapt before gradually extending the window. On the topic of supplements, I want to be direct and clear. Because the market for these products is substantial, but largely not grounded in the rigorous evidence we have been discussing, there is currently no oral supplement available that has been unequivocally demonstrated in rigorous human clinical trials to specifically and safely activate adult stem cells. products marketed with such language are simply not backed by the peer-reviewed scientific literature. If you encounter a stem cell activator supplement, the claim on the label is not supported by any science that I am aware of. There are, however, specific micronutrients with legitimate evidence for supporting the cellular processes we have described. Vitamin D3 is arguably the most important of these. Deficiency is extraordinarily common in adults over 50, and vitamin D plays a direct and crucial role in immune cell differentiation and inflammatory regulation, both of which are intimately tied to optimal stem cell niche health. I strongly recommend measuring your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level. A level below 30 nanograms per milliliter is considered deficient by most clinical definitions. The range supported by functional outcome data, not just by deficiency prevention, is roughly 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter. Supplementation to achieve and maintain that range typically requires somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 IU daily, though individual variation is significant, and some people, particularly those who spend minimal time outdoors, may require more. The only way to truly know your optimal dosage is to measure. Magnesium is substantially underappreciated in this context. It acts as a crucial cofactor for over 300 enzymatic reactions in the body, including several directly involved in DNA repair. Precisely the process that protects stem cells from the accumulation of genetic damage we have discussed throughout. Magnesium deficiency is remarkably common in people who consume a high proportion of ultra-processed foods, partly because industrial food processing removes much of the natural magnesium from raw ingredients. Magnesium citrate, or magnesium glycinate, in the range of 300 to 400 mg daily, is generally well tolerated by most individuals. A quick note, if you take certain antibiotics, take magnesium with a 2-hour separation to avoid impairing antibiotic absorption. Omega-3 fatty acids, ideally from a high-quality fish oil, targeting 1 to 3 grams of combined EPA and DHA daily, have the most consistent human evidence for reducing the systemic inflammation markers we have identified as directly hostile to stem cell niches. If you are currently on anticoagulant therapy, please discuss this with your physician before starting high-dose omega-3s, as they can have a modest anticoagulant effect. A specific caution on antioxidants. I will not recommend high-dose, isolated antioxidant supplements, such as vitamin C above 2 grams daily or vitamin E above 400 international units daily. The intuitive idea that more antioxidants neutralize more oxidative damage sounds logical. However, there is growing scientific evidence that stem cells actually require a certain baseline level of reactive oxygen species, ROS, to function as vital signaling molecules for proper function and differentiation. Flooding the system with isolated, high-dose antioxidants may inadvertently interfere with this delicate signaling. Antioxidants obtained from whole foods, such as berries, diverse vegetables, and green tea, do not create this concern because they arrive in complex natural matrices with inherent dose constraints. I want to address what monitoring progress looks like, because one of the most common questions I receive from patients who are making these important changes is, how do I know if this is working? The standard blood work I consider most informative for tracking the cellular aging picture we have been discussing is a complete blood count, CBC, which reflects the output quality of your hematopoietic stem cells in a practical and accessible way. If your CBC consistently shows patterns of mild anemia, reduced platelet counts, or abnormal white cell differentials that are not fully explained by other clear causes, that is definitely worth investigating as a possible stem cell signal. High-sensitivity C-reactive protein, hsCRP, is the most widely available and reliable marker of systemic inflammation. A reading below 1.00 mg/L generally represents a low inflammatory state. Most people who make consistent progress on sleep quality, dietary pattern, and stress management typically see this number fall meaningfully over a period of 3 to 6 months. Hemoglobin A1C, HbA1c, reflects the average glycemic environment your cells have been living in and is well worth tracking quarterly if you are making significant metabolic changes. Your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level is crucial because maintaining the 40 to 60 ng/ml window truly matters and often fluctuates seasonally for most people in northern latitudes. Finally, ferritin, which reflects your iron storage, is closely tied to hematopoietic function. Iron deficiency is common in this age group and is often missed because a frank anemia has not yet developed, even though the stem cell stress from iron insufficiency is very real. Wearable technology that tracks resting heart rate and heart rate variability, HRV, over time is generally extremely useful as a proxy for your recovery status and overall autonomic nervous system health. A resting heart rate creeping upward over weeks, despite maintaining or even reducing your exercise load, is a powerful signal worth paying close attention to. Heart rate variability declining over time is one of the clearest wearable indicators that the cumulative load of sleep disruption, unmanaged stress, and excessive exercise demand is pushing your system toward a state of chronic strain. You don't need to obsessively optimize these numbers, but tracking them provides a kind of accessible biological feedback that was simply not available to previous generations, and it is absolutely worth utilizing. What does a reasonable timeline for experiencing these changes look like? In the first 2 weeks, the most common shift people notice is subjective and often subtle, a different quality of morning alertness. It's not necessarily dramatically better overnight, but it's different in character, a little more subtle, a little less like you are fighting against the morning to wake up. If you are simultaneously reducing your intake of ultra-processed foods, be prepared for the first 3 to 5 days to involve stronger than usual food cravings, because the flavor engineering in those products is sophisticated and deliberately designed to create dependency. Rest assured, those cravings will pass. The underlying biology on the other side of them is quieter and significantly more stable. By the end of the first month, blood markers that respond relatively quickly begin to show movement in individuals who have made meaningful changes in both their sleep and dietary patterns. High sensitivity CRP, in particular, tends to be one of the earlier responders. Many people also report that exercise recovery begins to feel meaningfully different. The same workout leaves them less depleted and sore the following morning. At the 2 to 3 month mark, it's typically when more significant metabolic changes become visible in standard blood work. Fasting glucose and HbA1c respond on this timescale if meaningful dietary changes have been consistently made. Body composition changes also become externally visible. Muscle mass, though it responds slowly, measurably increases with consistent resistance training, even in people who had come to believe that muscle loss in their 60s was simply inevitable. The changes that reflect actual stem cell biology, rather than just downstream symptoms, generally take longer to measure, and most of us do not have access to the specialized assays used in research settings. However, what you are likely to notice over the 1 to 2 year range of consistent implementation, if you apply these principles diligently, is a distinct pattern rather than a single dramatic improvement. You'll experience fewer and shorter illness episodes because the immune output of healthier hematopoietic stem cells is more responsive and precise. You'll observe better recovery from physical effort because your muscle satellite cells are more functional. Wounds will heal more cleanly, and you'll develop a profound quality of physical resilience that doesn't necessarily show up as peak performance, but as a baseline vitality that simply does not keep declining the way it was before. The research that I personally find most intellectually striking in everything I reviewed for this conversation is not about damage at all. It is about the extraordinary capacity for restoration. The Columbia 2024 work demonstrating that fasting refeeding cycles could almost normalize the function of aged hematopoietic stem cells to a level seen in young animals is significant not just as a practical prescription, but as a powerful proof of principle. The aging stem cell system retains far more plasticity than the scientific field understood even 5 short years ago. Your stem cells are not passively counting down to a fixed endpoint. They are actively responding to signals from their environment right now. And the environment you consciously create through your daily choices is a genuinely powerful variable. There are some aspects I want to be entirely honest about, in the spirit of not overstating the certainty of the evidence. Many of the studies we discussed today, the MIT fasting work, the Columbia stem cell restoration findings, the Cell Stem Cell Exercise Atlas, utilized animal models. While the translation to human biology is strongly supported by mechanistic plausibility and by human epidemiological data showing consistent patterns, the rigorous, long-term controlled trials in human subjects that would allow us to state specific quantitative predictions with absolute certainty have not all been conducted yet. When I tell you that Zone 2 exercise protects stem cells, I am extrapolating from an extraordinarily detailed biological atlas that used animal models, informed by extensive human exercise physiology data and population-level associations. The evidence is coherent and substantial. It is not, however, identical to having a 30-year randomized controlled trial in humans that measured stem cell counts as a primary endpoint. What this means practically is that the interventions I have described are entirely consistent with the best available evidence and offer excellent general health benefits independent of their specific stem cell effects. Better sleep, reduced ultra-processed food consumption, appropriate exercise, and managed chronic stress. These would be beneficial recommendations regardless of the stem cell data. The stem cell research simply adds a powerful mechanistic understanding of why they matter so specifically in this age group and with such a degree of urgency. It does not require you to suspend judgment or accept speculative claims. The foundational science is solid. I also want to be honest that there is considerable individual variation in all of this. The same dietary change that meaningfully reduces HSCRP in one person may produce a smaller effect in another, depending on their unique genetics, microbiome composition, metabolic history, and dozens of other variables that large population-level studies tend to smooth over. The ultimate target is not to perfectly replicate a research protocol. The target is directional. Move consistently away from the habits that the evidence identifies as harmful and move consistently toward the ones identified as protective. Then, use your own measurable biomarkers and your own subjective experience of energy, recovery, and resilience to calibrate and fine-tune your approach over time. There is one more crucial thing I want to say before we conclude. People in their 50s and 60s have largely grown up within a medical culture that has historically treated aging as something to, at best, manage and slow down, but not something to meaningfully reverse. The prevailing framing was fundamentally passive. These things decline. We will try to minimize the rate of decline. We accept the rest. What the emerging science of stem cell biology is now beginning to offer us is a fundamentally different and far more empowering frame. The declines we commonly associate with aging in immune function, muscle maintenance, tissue repair, and metabolic resilience are substantially, though not entirely, driven by the condition of a cellular population that is profoundly responsive to its environment. Change that environment, and that vital cell population responds. This is not a promise of immortality or a miraculous cure for aging. The biology is far more complex and humbling than that. But it is a meaningful shift in our sense of agency. The habits we have discussed today are not just marginal lifestyle optimizations. At the deepest cellular level, they are powerful signals that either fundamentally support or actively undermine the very system your body most depends on for the constant repairs and critical adaptations that will ultimately determine how well and how independently you age. I spent years inadvertently sending the wrong signals to my body because I simply did not know what I know now, and because this information was not easily accessible or clearly communicated. That is precisely the reason I do this work, and it is why these conversations truly matter to me. If you found this discussion useful, the video on mitochondrial function and aging in the description links directly to the mechanisms we covered today and goes deeper on the energy production side of cellular aging. I believe you will find that it adds a significant and illuminating layer to what we have discussed here. Please feel free to leave a comment with what surprised you most, or the habit you are going to address first. Those comments often genuinely shape what I research next, and I make an effort to read every single one. Keep investigating, keep asking hard questions of all the information you receive, including from me.